Hi, welcome to a lesson before writing. This is episode number 16. I had to double check. We're getting so many, it's hard to keep track. I'm Ted Morrissey, and I'm here with my co hosts, Grant Tracy and Brady Harrison. Let me just give a quick shout out to their most recent books that we have published. For Brady, it's The Term Between, a collection which won the High Plains Book Award. Very cool. And Grant's most recent release by us is the Hayden Fuller Mystery Neon Kiss. I have both of these guys. I've got the new books in the works, and if you are a loyal listener of our podcast, viewer of our podcast, you know I've been talking about that forever. And it's just so hard to get the time, especially this time of year, to work on those. But I'm determined that we're going to get those out into the world. So stay tuned. I will mention my most recent book, The Strophes of Job. This episode is our October episode, of course, and it's spooky themed. We did a similar one last October and had kind of a blast with that. So we thought we'd do it again. In the spirit of that, this does have some ghostly figures in it, I will say. But I just wanted to plug a couple of my books while I'm at it because of they're right for the season. In 2014, I released An Untimely Frost. And this was a novel that I wrote based on the fact that when the American novelist Washington Irving was in London, there was a brief time where he and Mary Shelley, the author of Frankenstein, of course, who was a widow by that time, kind of toyed with the idea, or maybe people around them toyed with the idea of their having a sort of romantic relationship. And that always kind of fascinated me. What would happen if the author of the Headless Horseman of Sleepy Hollow and the author of Frankenstein got together? And so that's what this book is about. An Untimely Frost. It imagines that relationship and what it might have been like or whatever. And then Mary Shelley has always been a big influence on me. And so another book that I wanted to underscore here was Mrs. Seville. And this came out in 2018. And those of you who are Frankenstein enthusiasts know that the whole novel that Mary Shelley wrote is an epistolary novel written to Margaret Seville. And that's all we know about her. She's in London, and she's worried about her brother, who is an Arctic explorer. And so the whole novel is one long letter from her brother to his sister, but we don't know anything about her, beyond those two facts. She lives in London and she's worried about her brother. So I decided many years ago I wanted to give her a story. So I wrote Mrs. Seville. It actually did pretty well for itself. It won the Manhattan Book Award. It was a finalist in some other awards. It even won an award for cover design. So I was very proud of that. My dad was an artist, so I know he would have liked that in particular. But anyway, I want to promote my Mary Shelley related books. All right. So we have a ghost story, a dyed-in-the-wool ghost story that we're going to talk about later in the podcast. But before I get to any of that stuff, Brady, you just gave a reading. You got to read from A Journey to Al Ramel, I believe. And then I think you told me the students had read one of the interviews that we have with you online, and so the Q&A kind of involved that as well, if I understood your message. And you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I had the good fortune to be invited to read and talk with students in a course at the University of Montana called Montana Writers Live, and it has hosted over the years a number of luminaries, and so I was very glad to have that chance and to count myself among among that number, an interloper. So the students read a story from The Term Between. So the instructor, buddy Robert Stubblefield, asked what story I would like them to read, and so I had them read The Pintlers, which is sort of my favorite in the collection in some ways. And they also read the interview that Ted, that we had done on the occasion of the release of The Term Between. So open by reading from A Journey to Al Ramel, the section where our young protagonist meets Nietzsche on a couple of occasions. And then, after that was a conversation, seemed to be for over an hour, about writing and about the small press world, literary journals. How do you develop characters? There's this great free ranging conversation. So it was a great honor, a great fun, and yeah, feel great about it. I don't know what the students thought, but I was glad.
Yeah, yeah, very cool, very cool. Well, yeah, your mention of Nietzsche, I think I'm going to call out Grant. I'm going to put you on the spot, Grant. So be ready.
All right, all right.
No, our last episode we did a story which I really liked. It was kind of like the three bears, Papa, Mama, and Baby Bear. I loved the story. I think Brady was fine with it. You had some reservations, which is fine. But we heard from the author, and he was thrilled that he was the featured author, and he loved our discussion, and blah blah blah. So it's all good. But no, in all seriousness or lack of seriousness, one of the things that you brought up about that story that you found a little bit artificial was all of the sort of literary kind of highbrow allusions. And I got what you were saying there. But after the podcast, was over and I was, working on uploading it to the different platforms, I thought, wait a second, you were working on a Shoe Shine Kill, this hard-boiled detective novel set in the 70s, and there are frequent references to Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass and the complete works of Shakespeare, among other things. So what's I know it's in all seriousness, how do you balance that? I mean, obviously you're writing in a genre that doesn't normally probably traffic in the complete works of Shakespeare. That's of course one of the reasons I love the series, and I'm happy to be its publisher. But what is your thought on why it's okay for Hayden to be dealing with the complete works of Shakespeare, but poor Thomas Heiss, had to get the cold shoulder because he mentioned a couple of literary allusions?
All right, you got me there. I plead the fifth on this, and I'm not even an American. No, you got me. I don't know what else to say about that. I do love Shakespeare, and I want like Fuller is not an educated, like university educated guy. He's got high school. He took a couple of courses to get his detective's license, through extended learning or whatever it is at York University. But he's, his wife's she studied with Northrop Frye. I mean, she's an English lit person and very knowledgeable. So, but I guess it is. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know. I don't know how to answer that, except he loves Shakespeare, and I just thought that'd be cool to occasionally have it. No, my problem with allusion, we had a poet come to our university. I'm not going to mention his name, but it was a really good reading, and he says, "I love you doing allusions." And then at one point, one of his poems, he had I got the world on a string. Like he had that line in his poem, and I said, "Oh, are you a Sinatra fan?" Well, I respect Sinatra, but blah 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 blah. And I think that's sometimes the problem with allusion. Once you start using them, or if you use too many of them, people are going to maybe start to see them where you, as the writer, don't necessarily want to see them. He's a Taylor Swift fan, and he respects Sinatra, but I don't think he was too pleased with me suggesting I saw, and I thought his phrasing, then I started reading into his poetry, like the phrasing felt like Sinatra, and it felt like when he entered into the world he has one poem that's about a pinball, and I felt like he leaned into being a pinball the way Sinatra leans into the personas. I think Sinatra is one of the greatest singers, and he brings a method acting approach to his singing. So I was seeing all these connections that obviously the poet did not want me to see, but I would not have been triggered to do that if I hadn't seen all these other allusions. So that's all I'm saying is maybe something to be aware of. I mean, the text and your audience is free to do whatever they want with it, but we all have intentions. We want our stuff taken a certain way. And so there's a danger of that. And as a matter of fact, in the more recent stories, I've scaled back. Like if someone does a move, well, you go, "Hey, Jackie Chan, knock it off." So that's an illusion, right? I mean, but and I felt like early on in my Hayden novels, there's a little too much of that sort of stuff. And so I've scaled back some of the cultural references that are kind of funny, but I don't know, it feels Mad Magazine-esque to me, holy, like, Robin saying, if somebody, says, "Hey, come and tell me to my face, holy Angela Mosca, Batman," That's an old commercial in Canada. Anyway, yeah. So that's my concern. That's all I'm saying. But
Well,
you're
well,
right. You got me. You got me, Copper.
well, I actually have a defense for you, and you kind of touched on it a little bit. And then let me throw it out there, and then I'll see if I'll make Brady the jury here. See, I'll play Grant's advocate. I thought maybe the difference is because it's terms of how close the writer is, the author is to the narrative persona. So in the story that we read last time, that was one of the things we talked about, this kind of thin veil between the author himself and the protagonist in the story. And so maybe, even though again I was really fond of it, maybe the sense was that the author, it's more the author throwing out these illusions as opposed to the character. It's almost like hearing somebody name dropping at a cocktail party or something. They're just trying to impress, the people that are around them or whatever. Whereas if you have a very clear, fictional character who is, dropping these illusions, there's less of a sense that the author is just being maybe overly erudite or something. So maybe it has to do with narrative distance between the author and the fictional character. Let me throw it over to the jury here, or the I don't know, the moderator or something. Brady, what do you think? Do you think can you get away with certain illusions that you can't get away with depending on the closeness of the narrative voice to the author's voice?
Well, as the foreman of the jury, poor person, I want to say that I enjoyed watching you pin Grant like a bug. So, sorry, G-Man. I'm just playing, of course. Yeah, I'm a big fan of references and allusions, and so I probably sort of fonder of the practice than Grant is, but I totally agree with Ted that it has to be appropriate to the story. It has to be appropriate to the character. And so if the author is, as Ted says, is sort of dropping in erudition for its own sake, then it's just clever and it's hollow. But the writers, some of the writers that I admire a great deal, say Melville. I mean, he lives in metaphor. He lives in allusion and elusive terrains. I think less pleasing, but wholly dependent in so many ways upon allusion, is T.S. Eliot. I mean, The Wasteland is sort of stitched together allusions, and so I'm far less warm about Eliot, though I admire him intellectually. I don't have that same degree of fondness. So somehow Melville makes it part of the terrain and the wonderful wanderings of Ishmael's mind, say in Moby Dick. So I love that richer terrain. I love those extra dimensions that are brought in through illusions. So I'm a fan, but it has to be right. It can't be forced. It can't be just stagey.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hey, I do want to get into some spooky stuff, but I had this topic has been sort of the front and center with my MFA students the last couple of weeks. I guess I made it front and center. Well, kind of. No, they kind of did. I'm gonna blame it on them. No, I'm gonna give them credit. So they're at a lot of them for their thesis. They are doing collections of short stories, collections of poetry, collection of nonfiction essays, that kind of thing, and one after the other in their kind of weekly journal postings to me and so forth, or they're like, losing sleep, just balls of anxiety about the sequencing of whatever it is, the stories or the poems or the essays or whatever. And I, basically told them, knock it off. There's no right answer. For every way you come up with to sequence your collection of poems or your collection of stories or whatever it is, every sequence is going to have some positives. You're going to gain some things here and there in terms of thematic units and whatever metaphors, but there's always loss too. Whenever you separate things and move things around, there's gains, but there's always going to be losses. So there literally is no perfect combination. It's just what you as the author in the moment feel like is working in a way that you want it to work, and just have fun with it, just enjoy it, and not to mention the fact that if you get a press or an agent who's interested in it, they very well may have some opinions about it, so you may have to revisit it in terms of sequencing. And then even if it gets out into the world exactly as you organize it yourself, how people read it, how people encounter it, especially like a poetry collection, I think they'll kind of jump around, they'll read from the middle, they'll read from the end. Story collections too, I know a lot of times I've gotten hold of those just for one of the stories, and so I'll read that one first, and it might be the 6th of 12 stories or whatever, and then maybe I'll jump around and read a little bit more. So let me come back to you particularly, Brady, now, and then I'll bounce it back to Grant, because it's been a while since Grant's done a collection per se. But like in the term between, or just in general, what do you think about the idea of sequencing? And did you lose sleep over the sequencing of the term between, or did you just kind of choose a sequence that made some sense to you and just kind of go with it?
Yeah, no, certainly didn't lose any sleep. I think I agonized for an hour once. I was totally restless for the 48 minutes straight. I think there's the question of tone. So in my judgment, in the stories that we eventually gathered into the term between, I wanted to have some variation in tone. Some of the stories are quite bleak. Some have not much, but some lighter touches. And so I was conscious of that kind of pattern. But I did have a sort of logic overall, a kind of, as I thought of it, a kind of faint line through on a kind of something along the lines of hope and not hope. And so the stories were organized from a certain degree of hopelessness to hope, and then hopelessness again, perhaps in the conclusion. But that wasn't a real forced logic. Nothing like, say, that Joyce achieves in Dubliners, where age is the controlling structure of this portrait of community and place. So yeah, I think your advice to your students was wise. Don't overthink it. And yeah, I think one of the conclusions I've come to, and I'll stop nattering on and pass this over to Grant, but I think in some ways I may have made a mistake with the first story in the term between. It's just too grim. I think people read that and went, "Oh, the rest of it's like this." So I think an opening gambit is crucial. After that, put them in the order you want.
Right. Yeah, Grant, obviously the first book of yours that I published was the collection Final Stanzas. And then previous to our getting together, your previous publisher had brought out 2 or 3 collections, I think. And then obviously you work with students all the time who are putting together collections. So what are some of your words of wisdom regarding that as both an author and an instructor?
Well, I think you both hit on some really big things. I mean, okay, this is kind of tricky, but for me, time and history and age, and Brady was mentioning age. So like, in one of my collections, there's the Matt Trachif character who's like a surrogate for me. And then there's other stories that aren't him, but I found myself that collection being built chronologically, so by years. And so the stories had to, and then I recently been putting together an Eddie Sands cab driving collection. But it's funny because I was going chronologically with the stories, and because they start around 1965, and then there's some stories that have flash forwards up to 1980, and things like that. And so as I started putting the stories together, I found there were certain ones I thought were stronger to have at the beginning. So I either did one of two things. I either put in I took out a flash forward, or I changed the time around so I could put the stories where I wanted in the sequence, so it could still be chronological, if that makes sense. And then with the Hayden Fuller novels, I mean, they've been sort of starting in the mid 60s and then 67, and then I jumped up to 72 for this one, for Shoeshine. but the one I just finished, Artifacts, goes back to 68. And I got that idea from, well, I just wanted something set then. And it just felt right for that novel. And I I got the idea from Max Allan Collins because he puts out these Quarry novels and they're not linear. So he'll all of a sudden have Quarry in a novel that's taking place around Watergate, and then he'll have another one that's taking place during the Flower Power, 60s, Haight-Ashbury time period. But they're set in Iowa and in the Midwest predominantly. But he moves her, and that sort of liberated me to be thinking of Hayden not as a linear timeline, because I know the first three stories you could also read as a collected novel. The first three novels could be one big novel. And I remember hearing a poet once say that my poetry collection is 24 poems, 23 poems inside the collection, and the book is the 24th poem. So the whole thing is a poem. And I was like, that's kind of brilliant. And there's a way in which I think I put that in the back of my head I didn't know I was writing, one big story over three novels. But now I'm more like, I just want to jump around, and, if I want to set a story Hayden Fuller being a detective, I might do that. Like I might do a novel set in 62, where he's a hockey player and doing some detective work, even though he's not officially a detective yet. So I just want to keep myself open to whatever I want to do. But I think when I started, because I have a strong background in history, I was a joint English and history major. I tend to follow the arc of time in the way I structure stuff.
Interesting. Yeah. All right. Well, let's go ahead and since we claim this is our spooky themed episode, let's get into some spooky stuff. So now I wanted to plug this book and this author, Carlos Fuentes. I don't know if you guys are familiar with Fuentes. He was a Mexican author, but he also was fluent in English. He did his graduate work in the United States, I think in Washington, D.C. in particular. And I don't know, I found Fuentes 25 years ago. So I've been reading him off and on all these years and really enjoying him. So he writes in Spanish generally, but then is very involved in the translation of his work from Spanish to English because of being fluent in both. Kind of very similar in that way to Nabokov, who, was very instrumental in translating his Russian work into English. But this book in particular, Aura, is it's a little novella really, but it's super, I don't know, unsettling. It's not strictly speaking a ghost story, but it takes place in this sort of dark and dilapidated mansion, and there's just all sorts of uncertainty. The main character is a graduate student who needs some money. Imagine a graduate student who needs money. What an odd thing. So he takes this job working on the memoirs of this dead general, kind of sorting through his papers and trying to sort it into a kind of cohesive manuscript. But like there's all these weird things going on in this mansion where part of the deal is he has to stay here. He wants to take all the stuff and go back to his apartment, but his widow who hires him is like, no, part of the deal is if you're going to make this money, you got to stay here in this decrepit, dark mansion. Anyway, it's just a great little novella. So I highly recommend Carlos Fuentes in general, but this little book this time of year, Aura, is just really terrific. I've read it multiple times. I'm reading it again, as you can see. And every time it just creeps me out and just has me completely mesmerized to the page or whatever. I don't know. Are you guys Fuentes fans? Have you read any Carlos Fuentes? Brady, are you familiar?
No,
I think I read a short story long ago.
Yeah.
But yeah, no expertise.
Okay, but kind of a Mexican postmodernist, which was something of a unique position to be in as well. How about you, Grant? Are you a?
No, I haven't. But I've seen and noted. I will pursue this book as soon as we're done here on the Zon.
Yeah. Go ahead. I'm sorry. Cut you off, Grant. Go ahead.
Oh no, I just because we love I love Halloween so much, because we love this time of year, and we've had this sort of themed podcast last year. I always am delighted. So this year in the spring, I'm teaching a course on the Brontes and Gothic fiction, and we'll do Castle of Otranto and Dracula, and we'll end with a bunch of short stories, Poe and Oates, A Rose for Emily. So although this is the season for it, I'm really looking forward to next semester so I can really indulge my fandom for the Gothic and extreme psychological states and bizarre goings on.
Well, I one of my most popular, maybe my most popular course I teach in the MFA program is a course on classic horror and sci-fi by women writers, and it actually starts next week, so the timing is pretty perfect. But it's I use an anthology that's chronologically organized. So it starts with Mary Shelley, like 1840-ish, and then no, earlier than that, 1830-ish, and then goes to Virginia Woolf. So it's both American and British women writers, but over about roughly 100-year time span. And like I said, the students really enjoy, and I really enjoy teaching it. So normally the timing is not perfect like this, but starting at this time of year is kind of ideal. So yeah. One of the things I do in that class, and some students kind of take to it right away, others are a little more resistant, but I have as a component in that class literary theory, and so I ask them each week to read a particular, actually usually a couple stories because they're pretty short. Read a couple of stories and to approach each one via some sort of critical lens: feminism, Marxism, psychoanalytic theory, queer theory, whatever it might be. And I have a couple of reasons for that, maybe three reasons. One is, like I said, the readings are pretty short for a graduate course. So when I first started teaching it a few years ago, I wanted another way to kind of flesh out, the syllabus a little bit. But also I thought that a lot of times readers who are writers even have kind of a default mode in terms of how they approach text. And so everything they read, they're kind of coming at it from a particular point of view. So they tend to see the same kinds of things in text after text after text. And so my hope is that by kind of forcing them to adopt a feminist lens or a Marxist lens or an eco-critical lens, that they'll see things in the work that they wouldn't have seen otherwise and have things to talk about and so forth and so on. And then another kind of very utilitarian goal is a lot of my students do go on to pursue other degrees, including PhDs. And I ran into this boat where the university where I did my master's was not interested in theory at all. So I had no education in theory. I guess we were new critics. I guess that was the theory that was at work. And then when I went to a different university to do my PhD, oh my gosh, they were all about theory. So I was going to these PhD seminars, and all they were talking about was Foucault and about, Derrida and about all this stuff. And so I had to do this crash course in literary theory. And so I hope that my students who do go on, one of the things, if they end up interviewing for a teaching position or as a candidate for a doctoral program or something, they'll be a little more grounded in theory than what I was when I was thrown into the deep end of the criticism pool when I did my PhD or whatever. But these kind of stories, these horror stories, really lend themselves nicely to critical analysis. In fact, the story we're going to talk about later in the podcast, there's all kinds of critical stuff that could be discussed there or could be approached via all sorts of critical lenses and so forth. So I don't know, Grant, do you do anything specifically with Gothic literature or maybe critical theory in your classes? How big is crit lit in your university's department?
Well, the crit lit, because I teach a lot of film and creative writing classes, so the crit lit that I do with creative writing is craft oriented, right? So I would approach Gothic as leaning into maybe plot, maybe the use of doppelgangers, maybe the use of getting outside the space-time logic continuum. That's one of the things that I like about genre fiction, and especially Gothic horror and crime stories, is that they transcend realism. I get a little tired of realism all the time. Like for me, there's just so much, it's that Hamlet to Horatio line, there's more to heaven and earth than are dreamed of in your philosophy. Sorry, I'm quoting Shakespeare again, but that's part of the pull of that kind of writing. And I get a lot of, actually, in my creative writing classes, I get a lot of high fantasy, a lot of fantasy, and a lot of gothic horror. And horror is a genre that the students really gravitate to. So that their approach is to thrill me, I guess. And that to me that's totally legit. I mean, instruct and delight, and there's nothing wrong with delighting readers. In terms of the theory side of it, I think critical theory is good as long as you don't let it get too much in your way as a writer. But it's like, it really changed the game for me. I mean, because there's just things as a writer, you read the stuff you want to write like, and then you start copying ideas without maybe being critical of choices you're making as a writer. And the theory enhances your ability to kind of say, oh, wait a second, that's a cliche, or that could be offensive, or whatever. And I don't have a problem with being aware of, representations that are offensive. Like, I think that's a healthy thing. And so, like, I deliberately in my stories try to play with the femme fatale trope, because I maybe it's coming out of my own personal experience of, growing up with an alcoholic father, but I use the l'homme fatale a lot more in my fiction than I use the femme fatale. And I think part of that is an awareness of feminist theory that's enlightened me to how a lot of film noirs, the whole agenda in the movies is to ascertain the guilt of women, as Laura Mulvey said in an essay of hers. And so that is not something I want to replicate in all my crime stories. I mean, obviously that's going to be a component, but that is not going to be the driving force of the evil woman, and how guilty she is behind the narrative. So I think theory can be healthy for an artist, but I also don't think it should, be a cancel culture kind of item either. I think as artists, we have to, be free to pursue whatever our truths are. So that's my complicated answer to that, I guess.
Yeah. So, Brady Missoula, what's the state of crit lit in your neck of the woods? Is it a big part of a lot of courses, or not as much, or does it just really depend on the professor who's teaching it?
No, I think literary and cultural theory are alive and well, for sure. And Ted, listening to your approach to teaching the stories and then bringing a variety of critical theoretical perspectives to bear, and so students can get some elasticity of mind and learn to approach things and to think in different ways. I think that's great. And I used to love, in the old days, I used to really love the Bedford Critical Editions. Do you remember those? They had like a primary text, and then they had a post-structuralist approach to Heart of Darkness, and a Marxist or Marxian approach, feminist to queer theory. And so that model has stuck with me. And so even if in my courses we don't always have time to bring in, say, the latest work in eco-criticism to bear, nonetheless, that informs the shape of our conversation. So it's, I'd say it's pretty, theory is alive and well. For my own part, I will say that over the years, my enthusiasm for strictly what I would judge to be kind of political readings has waned. I think I may be becoming an old fuddy-duddy, but I'm really interested in narratology and interested in genre theory, because I think, like, we should talk about books as well as cultural objects. And so I think sometimes some schools of theory lean too far, at least in my judgment, into certain kinds of thematics, whereas I'm always happy to talk about those issues, of course, but also try to remind us that we read books for a reason, that books do things that movies don't do or do differently, that music doesn't do or does differently. And so the very bookness and narrative structures I think I probably maybe old school in foregrounding those. I mean, who cares about genre anymore? I do.
I do. Big
Right,
time.
right. Well, I started off kind of talking about Mary Shelley and Frankenstein. And I didn't realize this until a few years ago. I mean, I've been teaching or did teach Frankenstein for decades, but I was at a conference, I think in 2019 maybe, and one of the things that came up was the fact that the trans community in particular had really embraced the novel Frankenstein because a lot of trans folks can sort of see themselves mirrored in the creature. A creature who is born via surgery, who is sort of rejected by society because of that fact, that because of their genesis or whatever, and maybe because they don't appear as one would some people would want them to in some ways. And so anyway, that was really eye-opening for me to think that in the trans community that the novel really resonated in a way that makes perfect sense once we're aware of it. But I think there's a lot of cases where the reader, can relate to the monster, the creature, or whatever it might be, right? I mean, we know that Mary Shelley, speaking of which, seemed to start off writing about the book with sympathies for Victor Frankenstein, but by the time she finished, her allegiance was more to the creature. She could relate to the creature's story much more in terms of isolation, in terms of loneliness, in terms of all those things that she was experiencing, and so she tended in that direction. And I think that's true of a lot of kind of horror stories where some readers at least can relate more to the monster or whatever is the source of the terror than they can the protagonist or the good guys or whatever you want to say. You're kind of nodding there, Grant. Do you have any examples in mind of that? Or
Yeah, I would just, as a guy who writes detective stories, that's exactly what attracts me to writing detective stories. I think there was a lot, and isolation, loneliness, sadness, resignation, the Pyrrhic journey. I mean, I like the idea of a heroic figure trying to do the right things, but as he goes on the journey, or she, depending on what you're writing, uh, they sort of find out something about the human condition, and it's not so great. And there's a truth there, and you die a little. And I guess that's, for me, the appeal of detective stories, which maybe that was triggered by monster stories. I don't know, because I loved monster stories as a kid. The Wolfman, someone that can't control changes that are happening. The Frankenstein monster, I think, as someone who's from Eastern Europe, or my ancestors, where I always felt different from, I grew up around a lot of Scottish and English kids in the suburb of Canada I grew up in. And so I always felt othered. And even though I didn't know that word, that's what I felt. I knew, I was different. And so there was a way in which these horror monsters spoke to me. And yeah, so totally on board with that aspect of both those genres, the horror genre and the uncanny. There's a sense of the uncanny in horror that makes us feel uncomfortable. And there's uncanny, I think, in detective stories, like just the nastiness of the world, and sort of things take us off guard, and we're like, wow, that's kind of creepy, so yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, Brady, what are your thoughts on terms of maybe being able to relate to the monster more so than the other elements in the story? Do you have any examples of that kind of thing?
Well, yeah, no, I agree with Grant that, I mean, part of what must be the attraction of, say, the Gothic, is that we all find in ourselves, or we all know about ourselves, or we know about the world, that there's a lot of extreme behavior out there. Now, yeah, how attractive and who we have sympathy for, yeah, that's more that's more challenging. Yeah, yeah, I'm gonna have to think about that one. I mean, of course, in Frankenstein, yeah, definitely share Mary Shelley's sympathy. Who cares about Victor? Let's kind of on the monsters, the creations. side. Some evil villains, Dracula, obviously they're compelling, and they're some of them are cool, and so they're attractive. So then you find yourself in the position of sort of admiring them, or I mean, even James Bond. One of the things I like so much about Daniel Craig's portrayal of James Bond, after he kills somebody, he often laughs, right? But he's the coolest guy ever, right? So yeah, I don't know. I just because of the time of year, just lately, almost every night, in honor of Halloween, I've been watching horror movies, and I got to say, I'm not always uh, sympathetic to the monsters. We're usually often just horrified and frightened.
Right.
You know.
Well, speaking of that, my son lives about an hour away, my oldest son, and a theater in his town through, I guess it started in September. Every weekend, they're on the big screen doing a classic horror movie, and we went a couple weeks ago and saw the Stanley Kubrick The Shining on the big screen, and I haven't seen that on the big screen, for 20, 30 years or whatever it might be. And yeah, hard to relate to Jack Nicholson's character and pull for him in The Shining, but they're gonna the weekend before actual Halloween, so it's coming right up here. They're doing The Exorcist, and so I think we're gonna go over and see the Exorcist on the big screen or whatever. But yeah, I think there's something about the big screen experience that really lends itself to horror movies. I mean, obviously we have a really nice setup here. We have big screen TV, and we watch a lot of stuff via streaming and enjoy it. But certain kinds of movies, you really need that big screen experience to fully appreciate them or whatever. And Grant, I'll go back to you, the film guy.
Yeah, definitely. Well, I'm a big fan of the Italian giallo movies. I had a PDA a few semesters ago, and I did a deep dive into these lurid exploitation films made in Italy, mid 60s up to about 1980, that I just think are visually stunning and interesting. And they're money-making things, and they're schlocky, but I absolutely love them. The other thing I was going to say, though, coming back to, I'm a little bit kinder to Victor Frankenstein than you guys, because I'm a big fan of people who are pushing the boundaries of knowledge. I love Oppenheimer, for example, and he's a Victor Frankenstein. He's a guy who, for what he perceived as a greater good, started, really, being transgressive and trying to figure out stuff with nuclear fission, and he comes up with the atomic bomb. And to me, he's an heroic figure. So it's that metaphor of the Garden of Eden, and I've used this in a couple of my novels. And there's the apple. Are you going to bite the apple and experience life, or are you going to just be in blissful ignorance? And I'd rather be experiencing and pursuing knowledge. And I'm an academic. There's a risk involved in that. What you learn can be Pyrrhic. So I kind of like Victor for being transgressive, I guess is what I'm saying. And I admire scientists that are out there taking risks and maybe breaking laws to hopefully find a greater good. So that's my feeling about it.
So you're saying if you'd lived in a different century, you may have been like a resurrection man and digging up cadavers for medical study?
I might have. I don't know. I've always thought if I was, I always thought I would have been an auto mechanic, if I was born like in 1930 or something, and I didn't have the opportunity to go to college. But it's tinkering with stuff and putting stuff together. So I see a connection here. Yeah. I could be. I wouldn't have been smart enough to be Victor Frankenstein. I would have been the guy digging the stuff up for him. Let's be real.
Well, I want to get back to you, Brady, but I do want to say, well, it's on my mind here that watching The Shining, there are so many techniques that Kubrick is bringing to bear on that story, which are, familiar to me because I showed my high school classes 2001: A Space Odyssey every year for like 25 years. I was mesmerized by it every time I showed it, and they'd be like, "You think this movie's good?" But in 2001, which came out in 1968, obviously kind of one of the pivotal moments in that is when the computer goes goes a little crazy and tries to, and takes over the ship because it feels like the humans on the ship have kind of gotten off track in terms of what their mission is, and boy, is that a precursor to some of our concerns about AI, artificial intelligence, and where is that all going? And so I think there was a lot of prescience, in terms of Arthur C. Clarke and Kubrick, in terms of this sort of yin and yang of the advancement of technology, that it can be wonderful, but there are some real dangers to it as well. So I don't know, I'll just throw it back to you, Brady. You can respond to any of that or bring up a new topic if you like.
No, since we're talking about Halloween and scary things and frightening things, yeah, I'll disagree a little bit with Grant. Like, I'm terrified of science and tech people. I mean, it's not just that I don't ever want to read another Chat GPT tech bro generated essay, right? I mean, are they to blame? Who's to blame? But I don't trust those guys at all. I don't think they have a greater good in mind, except for their own greater good. Yes, I'm very suspicious of those technological technocratic people. I think they see pots of gold, and I don't think they care too much about anything else. Maybe just my reading. So yeah, they scare the hell out of me. Yeah, if we want to talk about the things that are frightening, it's people.
Well, there's what, the AI folks, I think I got this term right, the black box phenomenon, where, AI technology, AI is self-educating, it's autodidactic. And so their AI, the programs, whatever you want to call it, are doing things that they did not program it to do, and they don't understand how it's happening. I remember, it's been like a year and a half ago or something. These scientists, their AI, whatever that is, was translating some text into French, but in a very rare, like, provincial French dialect. And they had no idea, like, why it was translating the text into French, and where in the world it learned this very unusual, French dialect. And of course, that's kind of an amusing story. But if you take a step back and realize, the AI is learning things and doing things and making decisions, if that's the right word for it, about things that their handlers, their Victor Frankensteins, have no idea what it's doing and why it's doing it, and so forth. There's all kinds of potential there for us storytellers, but I find it fascinating, but also, potentially a little terrifying as well. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think I mean, the technology seems like it could easily eclipse us. I mean, there is a little side to this too, just as an aside to any conversation about AI. From a certain perspective, it might be that they're stealing information. They might be not paying for all the vast pools of knowledge that they're feeding into these systems. So when they're reading Grant's books, we might not be getting a royalty check. so, so yeah, there might be borrowings going on that are not wholly authorized.
Well, I know. Go ahead, Grant.
Oh, I just think we need to find a way to live with it. I'm not running from it. I'm not using it to create plots or to write my stuff. But like I did a church play a few weeks ago, and I was wondering, based on a theme, and I just, I write these things for church every once in a while, and then I stepped away from, like, God damn, what are the scripture passages that would go with this? So I fed my play into AI, and it was very complimentary. Thank you. It's for the very kind, the AI. I think it was Claude. I ran it through Claude, and it came up with about 8 scripture passages, and then I went to the scriptures, and I liked about 3 of them, and then I used them, like, for the sermon. It's like, here's the script. So for me, that was a tool to help me get the whole church service ready, but I wrote the damn play. No one's going to write that for me. And that's the thing that scares me a little bit, is I don't want to read, student generated work that's gone through AI that that AI's written their thesis from. You come up with the thesis, and then it can help. It's like a calculator. I'm not that scared of it, but you have to trust people to use it right. And I know students won't use it right. That's just something we're going to have to, maybe we could just go to a pass-fail system in the universities, and then we don't have to worry about all this. But I actually think grades are ridiculous anyway. That's a whole nother matter. So yeah, I don't know. I'm finding I'm going to teach Godzilla X-1 or minus whatever it is, late in the semester. So I said, hey, I'm teaching a first year class, introduction to film, and I had my own lecture notes. All figured out, things I wanted to talk about, the kamikaze philosophy, all the stuff, what was going on in Japan, cultural context, blah 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 blah. Then I fed it through AI, and it came up with some additional things that I couldn't think of, and I thought, oh, that's cool. Or I was going to do a shot-by-shot breakdown of the ending of White Heat, and I thought, well, let's just feed it through AI, and it did it for me, and it saved me hours because I would have been in front of the TV, and then I double checked it, but it was right. I mean, I was like, wow, this is blowing my mind. So I can spend more time on other things I want to do in terms of teaching White Heat, and not spend 3 hours of my time going through the ending and So I see it as a tool. We have to learn how to use it and use it properly. That's my feeling.
Well,
I'm not
right.
running in the room screaming.
Well, there's no point in it because, unless
It's
you're
here.
going to
And
enjoy
my
it.
university on our website encourages students to use it. What are we using? It's not Claude. It's something point, ClearPoint. It's right there in our, and then of course they do say check with each individual professor because we all have different opinions about this. But so students are running their papers through, for grammar and spell and all that stuff. And so yeah, it's right on our website.
Right.
So
Well, yeah, one of the universities I teach for, there was some kind of committee to come up with some kind of AI policy, and
mm,
like a year and a half ago or so, kind of the frame of mind was the AI is bad and we should prohibit students from using it. But by the time this policy came out this past summer, I mean, it's multi-page, policy for both students and teachers and blah blah blah. And really, what it boils down to, it reminds me of like the little blurb they have at the end of alcohol commercials. Please drink responsibly. I mean, this whole
gambling
multi-page.
commercials.
Please use AI responsibly. That's what it all kind of boiled down to, So, yeah. Well, you mentioned Godzilla, and that's a great example of a monster that most, people pull for. Godzilla, King Kong, they're the most attractive features while they're stomping cities and, knocking buildings over. People are like, hooray, for the monsters or whatever.
Well, that's when I knew my daughter was a pretty cool gal. I had a couple experiences with Devin when she was young. That I knew she had empathins running out. She watched Bamboozled with me, and she was probably too young. But I remember at the end of Bamboozled, she's crying next to me, like that whole 13-minute documentary that Spike Lee ends the film with. She understand the degradation that was. She got it.
Mhm.
Similarly, I showed her King Kong when she was even younger, and she's crying at the end when the monster falls off the Empire State Building. Like she was, beauty killed the beast, whatever. But she felt for Kong, and so I think there's value in that, I guess, in these monster stories that. And I agree with Brady. Not all monsters are great. Jack the Ripper's a monster. I mean, I can think of many monsters in horror film. I've always found the Mummy creepy. I don't identify with the Mummy. Get out of here. But
Not even the older you get, you don't identify?
no, but Wolfman, I do. I love the Wolfman. I mean, any boy who's now a man and has gone through puberty understands the Wolfman, things beyond our control. We get it. The moon comes out, hormones are doing weird things. To me, the Wolfman is it's like a drum beat. It's our heart. It's there. We know it. We get it, and we're empathetic. So anyway, but yeah, I love empathizing with. How can you not empathize with the creature from the Black Lagoon? He's like King Kong underwater. I mean, I don't know. He's one of my favorites too. Go man.
Well, let me. We probably looking at the clock here. We probably need to switch gears into our featured story.
Well, it's a good one.
Our loyal readers know that, or readers, our loyal listeners and viewers know that every episode we have a featured story at the end. And because of our Halloween theme, I got these guys a ghost story of sorts, a horror story to read. And I'll just plug it. It comes from this anthology, New Ghost Stories 4, which is produced by the Fiction Desk, and they do all kinds of little books and so forth. So check out the Fiction Desk online and check out some of their other little books that they put out. They put out other ghost story books, obviously, since this is number 4. But we're going to particularly look at a story titled Yellow Rock by Jo Gatford, Joe, a female author, I presume.
J-O. J-O, not J-O-E, J-O.
Oh, I'm sorry. I meant to say J-O. Yeah, just J-O. Right. Thank you. So Jo Gatford. And I'll just read maybe the beginning of the story, and then we'll kind of jump in here to see what you guys have to say about Yellow Rock from New Ghost Stories 4, which I just got, a couple months ago, maybe even more recently than that. It begins. No one will say it out loud, but something strange is going on in mind number 8. I count the faces as they emerge from the tunnel, name each man with a nod one by one to show that I'm not just counting cattle, but they don't even look up at me anymore. They don't care if I know who they are. All they know is it takes a day to replace them, and the shift goes on regardless. All they know is that today they got to come back. So that's just the very first brief paragraph. And so basically the idea here is it's set. There's this mine, a gold mine that workers are sent into every day. And the protagonist, the main character, is an accountant, basically. And his job is to count the number of miners going into the mine when their shift begins, and then count the number as they come out to make sure, obviously, those numbers match. But they're not. They're a miner or two short each time. And then on top of that, the protagonist, even though on the one hand, he knows that the numbers are off and he's been trying to keep meticulous account of it all like he always does, but the numbers start to get harder to keep track of. The figures on the page seem to become sort of ghostly, and they morph into different figures. And his recollection of the miners' names and their faces gets fuzzier and fuzzier as the story goes on. So part of the tension and the kind of the horror of the story is this accountant losing his ability to keep track of everything that he meticulously wants to keep track of. So let me stop there with that little sort of introduction, and let me kick it back to Brady. You haven't had a chance to talk for a little bit here. What was your reaction to Jo Gatford's Yellow Rock?
Well, yes. So I think Grant is going to be more enthusiastic about the story than I am. There are a couple of features of it that I like very well. This is not to say I don't like the story, but I think Grant is going to be keener on it. But I did think two observations, maybe not worth a stale Halloween candy. But on the one hand, I thought it was part of what was chilling about this story was its accuracy about labor relations. Like nobody really cares about the people that go down the mine, and if a couple of them don't come back out, well, these things happen. So in terms of a kind of portrait of what is horrifying is just as you said, Ted, earlier, if you say no to this work, and so you're working too much and we're all too busy and we're all being asked constantly to add to our responsibilities, there's somebody behind us who will gladly take our job, and nobody's going to blink an eye if you say no. There's the door, good luck. So in that sense, the story is perfectly horrifying. Yeah. Oh, when Abacus talks to the owner, like, well, where'd they go? On the other hand, a second thing about the story, I wonder if it's a tale of what happens to the mind. It's what's horrifying is cognitive decline, the failure of memory. And so that feature of the story, the desire to keep track, the desire to know the world and to have some ground to stand on in one's life, and yet to find it failing, that is horrifying. That is alarming. So I don't know in either of those cases if Joe Gatford is, wants readers to take away those things, but that's some of what I saw going on in the story. Uh, I'll stop nattering and pass over to Grant.
Oh, that was awesome. Yeah, I thought it was a real page turner, and paragraph 3, I thought what a great hook to open this up with. The strangeness is down there under the rock inside the earth. It fiddles with a person's thinking. And that's going to become a through line in this story. Thinking and numbers on the ledger disappearing, blinking, and going away. Messes with my numbers. And I will swear on anything that moves. There's nothing wrong with my counting. That's why Mr. Fallow gave me this job. Fastidious, he called me. But I will also swear blind that 3 Tuesdays ago, 64 men walked out of that hole when I know for a fact 65 walked in. And I thought, what a great hook. So this is going to be about this part of the thing about the story is going to be about disappearing, dissolving. Reminds me a little bit of and I don't have a problem saying things like I know, like in my workshop sometimes someone says it reminds me of, then the writer's like, oh my god, I'm not original, and I'm like, no one's original. There's a great lake of ideas and we just add to it and borrow from it. Reminds me of Richard Matheson's Incredible Shrinking Man, where he keeps getting smaller and smaller and smaller till at the end he just becomes pure energy and isn't seen. And so there's a kind of this dissolving aspect, and then that kind of like acceptance, so a strange acceptance of this. But I think as I get older, you know, you're gonna laugh at me here, but you start to feel more and more invisible. Like you become, not that I've ever flirted with girls. That's not my thing, but I still want to be charismatic in a kind of sexual way. I want that, and I don't have it anymore. You get to be, well, maybe you do with the over 55 crowd, but I just don't have it. And that's, there's something kind of comforting about that. But I also just feel like people don't see me. There's a way in which you become invisible. And so I got a little bit of a vibe about that in the piece too, that I found really attractive. And the idea, I think when you get older, the idea of legacy and how you're going to be remembered and all that stuff. And these people aren't even remembered. And there's a way in which there's a collective forgetting going on, like Brady was talking about. And I just thought that was really, really awesome and creepy. And I think maybe as I get older, those are things that I worry about is I want to be remembered for something when I'm gone, helping young writers develop, whatever my legacy might be. I don't know. But that is a concern. And I like that about the story. And one of the other things I like is our narrator isn't the most lovable character, and so I sort of appreciate that. I find a lot of my students today, like if somebody's, I don't know if they're learning this in high school, like they're so dismissive, like I didn't like this character, therefore I don't like the story, and I love the story, and this character's kind of company man a little bit, working for the company, but then starts to get more and more affected, and then gets immersed, embedded into what's happening. So I thought it was really, really, really cool, and I like the progression. I love the narrative escalation, how the story kept building in terms of suspense and what was happening as the numbers keep happening and more people disappear. I was like, wow, this is cool. Now where's this going to go? Are we going to get the absent reverse shot? The movie Mildred Pierce starts off with a guy getting shot and going, Mildred. And then we're wondering throughout the whole movie, who the hell, Mildred must have done it. And then we find out it wasn't Mildred, because it ends with the reverse shot and we see it's Vita that did the killing. Jacob's Ladder. Somebody dies at the beginning and we're going through the whole movie. Who is it? And we find out it's ourselves, and it's the U.S. military killing themselves. And, Tim Robbins, great movie, by the way. So I wondered about that as a monster film. Are we going to get to see the monster? And I don't want to give it away, but I do like how the writer plays with those expectations and gives us a nice turn or twist on that. So I thought it was very accomplished and entertaining as hell.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I'll just throw out kind of related to that. The last Halloween episode we did a year ago, one of the things we talked a lot about was the Gothic haunted house trope and how that's been sort of used by various, writers and film screenwriters in terms of like, transforming like a spaceship into a Gothic space or something like this. This story is interesting because clearly the mine that the workers are going into is a sort of potentially Gothic space. Like, the narrator tells us the same glowing yellow eye that led me into the mouth of the beast. And so the mine shaft is a sort of beast, is a sort of it is the creature, is the monster, but also one can imagine that it's dark and it's dank and all this stuff. But most of the story takes place not in the Gothic space. So part of the tension is the main character, are they going to go into the haunted house? Are they going to go into the Gothic space or aren't they? So it's kind of an interesting twist on that. So the tension isn't from being in it. The tension is, are they going to go into it in the first place? I don't know. Brady, do you have any thoughts on that? The anticipation of the Gothic in some ways.
No, I agree. I agree too with Grant. It's very well paced. Right. It really hooks you right from the get go, and you're kind of what's going on, what is the situation, and I mean, what could be better in terms of a Gothic setting? Of course, historically it's been dungeons and undergrounds and caves, and so mine is is perfectly in the it already is divided. The story already operates on that Gothic level of the conscious mind and the subconscious mind, or whatever is going on, whatever monstrous thing, excuse me, is going on. And so again, without giving anything away, the the workers are confused. The workers aren't happy. The workers aren't making eye contact, but they show up every day, right? There's something that's compelling them. And yes, they have to make a living, but is there something more? So there is a kind of the Gothic, the haunting of the Gothic or the fearful thing, even though Abacus is above ground, yeah, it works really well because what is it? It's just as Grant said, what is it down there? So yeah, it's a fun little story. It's not very long. It
No.
it accomplishes a lot and keeps the pace going.
Yeah, and there's a kind of mesmerizing quality, like you were suggesting, Brady, that lures us as the readers into that space too, along with Abacus, which I think is cool. And then, like, I was thinking about some of your early comments about the working conditions. The story feels like it's set in the past to me, like, and I know there's still mines. I'm not ignorant, but it just feels like maybe 19th century, early 20th century. But I love he spat in the this is just a small moment. He spat in the dust at my feet. It was thick and black. I watched it sink into the thirsty desert and disappear. And it's like this is like a metaphor for the whole story. I mean, what's going on? I mean, it's obviously alluding to black lung, in which we know a lot about, and the conditions that people working in miners faced because of the unsafe conditions, and just that idea of a thirsty desert, thirsty. That's a great adjective, and disappear, and that's kind of what goes on here. So just some sputum that someone spits out has all this other ramifications and meaning that I thought was really cool. Subtle, but foreshadowing. I loved it.
Right. Well, the fact that first the workers call him Abacus. It's probably today there wouldn't be workers' first choice to dub the accountant Abacus. Bean counter maybe would be, but the fact he's using a ledger and not a spreadsheet, or Excel or something, that gives us a pretty good clue that it's an older kind of time period. I don't know if you guys saw this in the news. It was just like the last week or so. There, somewhere out west. There's an abandoned gold mine, but it's a tourist attraction. So they take tourists down, I forget, a mile and something below the surface, and it broke. Like the elevator broke while people were going down, and a bunch of people got hurt. And then there was another group down there. The idea is, group goes down, they get a little tour of the mine, and then they wait, and then the elevator comes back down with another group, blah, blah, blah. Well, they were stuck down there for like 7 hours because it took them that long to rescue the people in the elevator and then get the elevator working again. And so those people, and of course, 7 hours is a long time, but that whole 7 hours, they didn't know if it was going to turn into 7 days, you know.
Right.
And then it kind of reminded me too of the story about the kids in Thailand, you know, who go into the cave, and then there is a sudden torrential downpour ahead of monsoon season, and so they get trapped in the cave, you know, and I mean, that's a true story too. Ron Howard did a really great film about it, by the way, which we watched. So there's a lot of contemporary, you know, situations that could certainly lead to a similar kind of narrative in terms of darkness, in terms of being trapped, in terms of whatever. So even though this story is kind of set in the past, it's, you know, it's playing with something that could very easily be a current kind of situation or whatever. Brady, did I see you kind of nodding about the mine story? Did you hear that? Well, that news of
Yeah, well, I forget the circumstances, or perhaps the news hasn't released it yet, or I didn't see it. But there was also a fatality,
Mhm.
and so it was a shocking kind of story. This story, to step away from that terrible event. This story also plays, I think, on one of those, sort of classic horror story, gothic, creep story tropes of being buried alive, right? It's at the
Yeah.
heart of Poe, and so your story, you're remembering these two occasions where actual folks get trapped underground. I mean, it must be one of the most terrifying things. I mean, I used for many years until my daughter was born, and I had to be responsible. I was quite a keen splunker, and spent a lot of time in caves, and I had no anxiety about that, no fear. But at the same time, one knows, I mean, the cup. Once I got good and stuck, and so I had a few moments of panic. Um, so you do know that it can happen. So
Yeah.
it's
Holy
back there. It's
shit,
it's it's
dude.
a primal fear buried alive.
Well, the other
Well,
thing we
go
haven't
ahead,
talked
Grant.
about, I was just going to say, there's a little Greco thing going on here too. With I don't know what you guys thought about that, like the music, like a choir boy. That feels like one of the Greek myths, about the music. Don't look back. Ooh, if you look back, and there's I don't know, the kind of tapping into that mythology. I thought was pretty cool.
Well, right, right. You know, as you guys have mentioned, it's a pretty brief story, and it is a page turner, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't have these kind of other levels at work as well. Let me, before I forget, because I do think we probably need to start to wrap this up. I think we're testing the patience of our audience yet again, but this is Joe Gatford's contributors note. It says that Joe Gatford writes flash disguised as poetry, poetry disguised as flash, and sometimes things are even longer than a page. Her work has most recently been published in The Forge, Tramp Set, Pithead Chapel, and Smoke Long Quarterly. She is the co-founder of @writers_HQ and occasionally tweets about weird 17th century mermaid titles at J.M. Gatford. She wants to live on your bookshelf. But I think we can see her interest and her, expertise when it comes to flash, particularly in poetry. That this has that sort of brevity of flash, not quite flash, obviously, but it's not a very long story. But yet there's a lot happening. I'm not a flash writer. I just don't. I'm not attracted to that form, but yet I do recognize that I think the sort of skill set that it takes to write flash well, can then lend itself nicely to any length, fiction in terms of compression, in terms of layering of things, and that kind of thing. So I don't know, Grant, as an editor of fiction, do you guys have a particular policy about flash, or is it just fiction, or do you ever turn
We
stuff away because it's too brief, or accept it
well,
because of its being
I think
flash?
we have a fallback for that, Ted, because it is hard to lay out a really short flash piece on our pages, given the magazine format, but they're perfect for our open space the online component of the magazine. And I'm happy to say that as time's gone on, online publishing isn't seen as less than like print publishing. I mean, I think real early on it was certainly seen that way. I had writers turn me down when, you know, I offered to publish it online. They thought that I was thinking it was second rate or not worth it. It's just that there's only so much space with the printed page. So the online space, you can go longer, and you can go shorter. And so, yeah, I love Flash. I can't do it. I'm with you, Ted. I like compression. That's why I like free and direct discourse, but I also like having a big canvas to tell a story on. And so I'm always impressed with people who can do it well. Yeah. So, but that would be my answer is, it's hard in our magazine to take a, 200, 350 word, like microfiction, 350 words or less. That would not look all that great on the page. We could do a one pager, but one page of prose could be anywhere from 700 to 950 words, I think, on our pages. So it just depends on how we lay it out. So anyway, those are my thoughts on that.
Now, Brady, some of the stories in the term between are on the shorter side. None of them would be flash, I don't think. Are you attracted to that form at all? Have you tried your hand at flash fiction writing?
Nothing super short, but certainly stories under a page. Yeah, I like that. And but I think it in part just comes from sheer restlessness on my part. Like I like everything. I want to try all kinds of forms, and so written prose poems and converted those into microfictions, and yeah, and deliberately. I mean, the story might. So we always have to give a shout out to Steve Davenport. One of my favorite stories in the term between is when my buddy Rick and I push Steve off a mountain. Like that's just good storytelling. Like that's just how it's a story everyone wants to read. It's what we want to know. We want to have that experience of pushing Steve off a mountain. So yeah, so I'm glad to try them out. Though certainly now working on a novel, I am enjoying the scope, the possibilities of the longer form. So I'm with Grant too on that.
Yeah. Well, we probably want to wrap things up here. I have had, in fact, just recently, a listener of the podcast say that they actually went and purchased some of the stuff that we talked about. And so I would highly recommend getting a hold of New Ghost Stories 4 from the Fiction Desk so you can find out what the heck is going on in the belly of the mine. Also, just other ghost stories here. But let me turn it back to you guys for just kind of final thoughts before I hit stop record. Grant, do you have any kind of final words of wisdom for us?
No, I just really like this story. I mean, it held my interest. I thought it was daring in terms of point of view perspective, because I kept wondering, how can this character be telling this story? And anyway, because like it's forgetting, but then it remembers to be able to tell the story. And I just sort of like I saw Italian Giallo last night, and this S&M weirdo makes this woman put on boots. And I think it's called something like Evelyn Rises from the Grave. And the boots just happen to fit. Now, if I were writing that as a scene with an S&M weirdo, I'd have the boots be too big or too tight on her toes, because that would be real. But like in these Giallos, we throw that out the window. And there's a little bit of that for me with this story, but I accept that as part of the convention. And I absolutely loved it.
Okay, all right, great. Brady, final thoughts?
But yeah, I won't speak to the story anymore, but I would say I've been thinking a lot lately about Gothic fiction, and I've been thinking about genres that have staying power, and the Gothic is just part of our landscape. Like I think it's a really interesting, and some folks, I guess, in the past would sort of think of it as a lesser form or something, but I think the Gothic has such staying power, has such interest, it has such compelling qualities. It's sort of permanently part of our mindscape now, and the cultural storytelling landscape, filmic landscape. So I don't think it rivals romance yet, though it maybe is part of that same school. King Arthur, Star Wars, Dune, whatever. But the Gothic, yeah. So get a hold of some good Gothic. It's pretty close to the beating heart of literature, I think.
Some good Gothic, by the way. Just want to throw that out there. Yeah, no, that's fantastic. So I'm going to go ahead and hit stop record. But I really appreciate you guys giving up some time this morning to record this podcast. I appreciate our listeners, of course. We'll be back together in about a month or so. And hopefully by then I can report some legitimate progress on both of your books. That's one of my goals. All right. Thanks, guys. And we will talk to you down the road.
All right.